Hi, Tom. Good evening.
Oh, Kathy, Professor Chomsky, how are you?
Good. How are you? Please call me Avi.
Thank you, Avi. Just watching here to see who I should let into this meeting or who I shouldn't.
Oh, be careful, Tom. Be careful, Tom, who you let in.
Look at that, Vic Vinky snuck through.
Did he? Darn. Good evening, Avi.
Hi.
I'm Kathy. I'm the treasurer for Rockla.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We all have to be nice to Kathy or we don't get paid. Okay.
Bruce Popper.
Avi,
Hi,
I know
Bruce.
you're in the process of writing a new book and I couldn't find the title here right away. What is the new book? I know it's about climate and how it affects people in Central America, but
Yeah, the title is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice.
okay.
I was just as I was waiting for the meeting to start, we're working on the cover right now, like the blurbs where they're going to go on the cover, who's going to go on top, who's going to go inside, who's going to go outside. So the last half hour I've spent going back and forth with my editor about it.
It sounds like a fun thing to do. A friend of mine just published a book too. It just came out. Do you know Graham Russell? And
Oh yeah, of course.
they just came out with Testimonial.
Oh yeah. I
And,
haven't actually seen the book yet. I've read parts of it online, but I haven't gotten the book itself.
well, it just reminded me, I gotta go grab a copy. I'll be right back. Talk amongst yourselves.
I'm actually going to go grab a copy of my book because I kind of like to have it at my side when I'm speaking, and I forgot to.
Go right ahead.
Hey, Vic. Hi.
Hi.
We got our masks off this time. Good to see you again. And hello to our guest speaker. Looking forward to this.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, howdy.
Arnie's on.
Hey, look who else is there.
Hey,
Bruce,
Arnie.
God.
Good evening.
Oh, Bruce Popper. I haven't seen you guys. Good to see you again, man. What a good gathering. Oh, man.
Okay. I have your book here too. All right. And this is Graham and Kathy Rowland's book. Is it backwards to you guys? Is it typed backwards?
It's forward.
No, it's
Okay,
correct.
it is for me. I don't know why. Oh, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. One of the many oddities of Zoom.
Yeah. Give everybody a few more minutes to sign in because I
John.
think
Hi, John. Mr.
we're
Goodman.
missing quite a few people yet. So,
Still early, Tom.
yes, it is. Well, I mean, it is 7, but well, a couple minutes too.
Oh, 6:59.
Gonna watch here or are you gonna?
Have you heard the news today? The Tap and Mallet is going to close.
Yeah.
It's a local bar.
Local
Avi.
out over in South Wedge.
Yeah.
Did they say why, Vic?
Not exactly.
Yeah, I know they were on the radio today.
COVID is a part of it, but not the whole story, I guess.
Mm.
Hello,
Hi,
Buffalo.
Jack. Jack and Liz. Good evening.
Hello, everybody.
Hello,
Hi. Jim.
hello. Well, it should be a good one.
Yes.
Hello, Jim.
Hello.
Abby, Jim Goodman is the gentleman that suggested your name. He's a journalist who writes a lot for the Progressive and other outlets. And Jim, we thank you for suggesting Abby to join us tonight.
Yes. Thank you, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Jim.
You've written some great books. You have a new one coming out now?
I have a new one coming out in April. Yeah.
On climate change, is that what?
Mhm.
Okay, look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too.
Okay. I remember hearing your father speak about 50 years ago.
You're dating yourself now, Jim.
Got 108 myself. Wow.
Gotta find something to put in here to make it more vertical.
9:30 today.
Right.
That's a nice fire. Look at that.
Yeah, Beth, your fireplace looks nice, but it's not making me feel any warmer over here.
Well, it made us feel warmer about a year ago when the photo was taken.
Well,
Oh, really? Huh?
well,
I was gonna say, those flames are not exactly leaping there.
So that's fake news then, huh?
There it is. It's,
they warm me up. I love them. Just looking at them the way they are. Boy. Well, Gail Mott's joining us.
What angle on climate change did you write about?
So the book is called Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. So it tries to both, I mean, I kind of wrote it with my undergraduate students in mind.
Yeah.
And I don't know, some of you may have seen my book, They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. So I kind of modeled it on that, like for people who have a generally sympathetic attitude, but don't have like arguments and facts at their fingertips. So some of it, parts of it deal with like technical issues and policy issues, like, you know, understanding what the different agreements have been. But the heart of the book is really the second half, where I talk about social, racial, and economic justice and how like climate change is built into the global economic system, and that we need to talk about sort of global, I'll actually talk a little bit about some of those issues today at the end, but global redistribution, that, you know, the energy guzzlers like us have to consume less so that, you know, the planet's scarce resources have to be, and, you know, emissions are a scarce resource, have to be distributed fairly.
That sounds great. I look forward to it.
So I would, you know, not the emissions themselves, but using the concept of like a carbon budget, like how much can we really continue to emit, and who gets to do the emitting from now on?
You going to talk about the Honduran elections in your presentation?
I wasn't planning to talk that much about the Honduran election. I'm not sure I have all that much to add to it besides what you've read in the news, and, you know, what it's going to mean for the future. You know, how much leeway, you know, what her project really is, how much leeway or autonomy she's going to have to carry out a different kind of project in Honduras. All that is like, I can't really say anything about it because we don't know yet. But I know that it's, you know, it's definitely inspired tremendous optimism among the Hondurans I know, and I think among Latin Americans in general.
What do you think of the reporting from the mainstream press out of Latin America?
You're kidding, right?
Yeah.
You mean the 1-inch long article in today's Boston Globe about the election in Honduras? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, they used to have people like Ray Bonner, a lot better, the foreign correspondents. I don't know what, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have real foreign correspondents who spoke the language and who were experts on the region they were reporting on. You know, I didn't always like what their take on things, but you know, it's kind of funny. In my class this afternoon, we just finished reading a book about Vietnam, and the book is called The Vietnam War: A Concise International History. And one of the students, I was so impressed, pointed out that he calls it an international history, but all of his sources are in English. Like he didn't use any sources in any language other than English. How can he call it an international history?
Mm.
Wow, I want you to be a history major.
There's Gail.
They keep us on our toes, those students, don't they? Well, I think it's time we get started here. And first of all, I'm Tom Ward. I'm the convener for the Rochester Committee on Latin America, and we're happy to be. Okay, we're gonna have to ask everybody to mute themselves. And we'll get started here tonight. So I have a few brief announcements. First of all, some of the upcoming things, I want to just let you know that we do have our January 5th meeting is already booked. And we'll be hearing from Becca Mahali Rank. She'll be talking from us on the ground in Nicaragua, talking about a viewpoint opposite maybe that of what we've been getting in the mainstream media, Jim, about the elections in Nicaragua, and try to sort our way through and find what the truth is and how it's really working out down there for the people of Nicaragua. On February 2nd, it's tentative right now, but it looks like we will have a speaker from Witness at the Border. Jim, you had suggested Tom Cunningham, I think his name was, or Cartwright, Thomas Cartwright. He's not available, but they're looking for someone who would be available. That will be on February 2nd. And so we'll find out some of the situation that's currently occurring at the immigration issues at the border. March 2nd, we haven't got a program lined up yet. So if you have a suggestion, please let me know, or let one of our steering committee members know it so we can get them booked. We are trying to get things booked earlier than we have been, and instead of running around in a panic. So actually like having like Avi chimed right in and joined us. And so we had this planned well enough in advance that we could announce it at our last meeting. So that's really helpful. So if you have a suggestion or some particular topic you really want to hear about in Latin America, please let me know. You can put it in the chat box if you want as we go through the evening. We're also looking for committee members. We didn't do our rice and beans dinner because of COVID, and that's our big fundraiser for the year. But as all of us are starting to, I think they call it aging, we're not able to perform the super miracles that we used to produce before. So we're looking for a committee to help us with that. So if you're so inclined to help us put together the many aspects of this dinner, we do have a White Dove Award winner. That's Dan Kavalik, who's done a lot of film work and documentaries and reporting on Nicaragua and other countries down there. So Dan will be looking forward to joining us, and we just need to come up with a date and make sure we have enough people to put this together, and so we can make it very successful. Again, see me or anybody on the steering committee. On a personal note, I would just like to say, I know Gail Mott is with us. I would just like to say that they had a wonderful memorial service for Peter on Saturday. I was able to watch it while I was in Boston over the holidays, but it was a beautiful service, and what a tribute to a great man who has worked side by side with his great wife, Gail, and trying to bring solidarity to the Latin American world and standing up for human rights and everything else. So it was a wonderful tribute, Gail. So you and everybody that participated in it did a great job planning that service. So we appreciate it. So it was great. Vic, is there anything that you want to tell us about the Cuba caravan? Is there any updates on that?
No, there's nothing really new. I mean, you'll see via the internet, there'll be some conversations about their visit, the tour, the caravan visit, and their return.
Okay. All right. Does anyone else have any announcements that they would like to make at this time? Remember, please, if you do, keep it brief as you can. Is there anything I don't know, Gail, if you've heard of anything locally in Rochester that might be happening for December 10th, the Human Rights Day, Human Rights Declaration. We can't hear you, Gail. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. There you are. Okay, Gail.
Briefly, no.
Pardon me?
Briefly, no. The committee disbanded and the issues are huge. We all need to do whatever we can.
Okay. If anybody hears of anything coming up for Human Rights Day, I know we used to have quite a gathering down by the river every, I think it's December 10th. And if you hear of any local actions, let us know, will you? And we'll get it out on our email list. If there's no other announcements, then let's introduce you to Professor Avi Chomsky. And Avi is joined us tonight from Salem, Massachusetts. This is the book that she'll be discussing tonight and bringing us up to date on it. And in here, I'll tell us that Avi is a professor of history and a coordinator of Latin American studies at Salem State University. She's the author of several books, including Undocumented and They Take Our Jobs. Avi has been active in the Latin American solidarity and immigrants' rights movements for more than 30 years and lives in Salem, Massachusetts. And Avi is also currently working on a book that she was discussing a little bit earlier for those of you that might have missed that, joining us a little bit later, called Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About the Climate. Avi, you want to say a little bit more about that book and when we might expect to be able to see it out?
40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Actually, the initial, the title and everything always go through changes along the way. So the original title was going to be 40 Critical Questions About Climate Change. And then as I started working on it, I realized that's not really what it was about. It was questions more than anything about climate justice. And, the argument being that we have to approach climate activism through the lens of justice, and that global economic injustice in a way is the cause of climate change. So yeah, it's coming out in April, and I started working on these two books at the same time. I had a sabbatical in the 2019-2020 academic year, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do on my sabbatical, and both of these books kind of crystallized in my mind. And at the beginning of the summer, when spring 2019 classes ended, I called up my editor at Beacon Press and said I wanted to talk to her about some ideas for my sabbatical. And I said, I actually want to write two books. And I described the two books to her, this Central America book and what I was then calling the climate change book. Now it's the climate justice book. And she said, I think if you were any one of my other authors, I would tell you no, but I actually think you can do this. And, we will send you contracts and give you advances and everything for these two books. So in the end, partly because of COVID, Beacon cut down their 2021 list. And so they decided to prioritize the Central America book and get that one out first and postpone the climate justice book to 2022. But I was really writing them pretty much both at the same time over my sabbatical.
That's fantastic. Before we get started with the program, that reminds me, I do want to just let you know about another book that's available now that just got released. It's called Testimonial. It's about Canadian mining in the aftermath of genocide in Guatemala. This is written by Graham Russell, who is one of our White Dove Award winners, and Catherine Nolan, who is a professor in Vancouver, I think, right? So this book is available, and I have some extra copies too. We bought some through Rockla. If you're interested, just let me know in the chat, and I'll make arrangements to be sure that I get one to you. It's interesting reading. And having visited some of these mining towns in Guatemala, it's quite a serious issue, that's for sure. They've suffered so much because of it. So without further ado, typically, Avi, we have about 30 to 45 minutes of speaking. If you need me to share my screen with you, do you have anything to share?
I'm not going to share the screen now. I'm just going to
Okay.
talk.
And then we have about a 15-20 minute time at the end for people to ask questions. If you have a question that you want to ask Avi, just put it in the chat box, or I can see just about everybody except those who don't have their cameras on. So if you do, just put your hand up. There's a Zoom thing for putting your hand up and I'll call on you, or just chime in. So
I actually feel like we're such a small group. It will be fine with me if you have questions while I'm talking. I kind of feel like I'm teaching a class here because I've been teaching my classes this way. But I'd be happy. I'm happy to be interrupted. It doesn't really distract me. It helps me see that everybody's paying attention and what. So if anybody has any questions or comments they want to make as we go along, I'd love to make this interactive, and feel free to use your Zoom hand raise. I might not see you if you just raise your hand like that, but I probably will. But if you use the Zoom reaction hand raiser, I'll definitely see that.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming to talk about Central America, one of my favorite things to talk about, and migration. As some of you may know before, so I've been involved in Central America for more than a generation, I guess, because it was before my kids were born, and now I have a grandchild. But the two issues, being involved in Central America solidarity and being involved in immigrant rights work, is really, they came together for me in the early 1980s when I was finishing college and starting graduate school. And so coming back to immigration in the 1990s, and especially in the early 2000s, and writing my books on immigration, and then coming back to Central America. I've been teaching a class on Central America ever since I first started teaching, which was in the fall of 1990, when after I got my PhD and got my first teaching job up at Bates College in Maine. And one of the things I noticed is that when I first started teaching the course, there were so many books to choose from that I could assign to my students, because everybody was writing books about Central America aimed at kind of general popular undergraduate level audiences, trying to bring what was happening in Central America to the US public. And then as the 1990s went on, and the 2000s and the 2010s, nobody's writing those books anymore. There's still a lot of scholarship going on in Central America. So if you want to know, like, really in-depth, specific, narrow topics, there's plenty of stuff. But what can I assign in an undergraduate class? I was going back to books that were published in the 1980s or early 1990s, because that's when those big surveys were published. And, of course, they didn't incorporate what happened after the 1990s, and they also didn't incorporate all of the new scholarship about earlier periods that has been written since the 1990s. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who is also a Central American historian, but he works on the 19th century El Salvador. I don't think that gives away who he is. There's a bunch of people who work on that period. And he asked what my book was about, and I said, well, it's tying together the the revolutions and the crushing of the revolutions with today's migration. And he said, how are you going to connect that? It's like, wow, I really need to write this book. If even Central American historians aren't seeing the connection, I definitely need to write this book. So I'll also just point out, and one of the reasons I call it Central America's forgotten history is that when I first started teaching, I could kind of count on my undergraduate students to be aware of things that were happening in Central America, to have been exposed to these growing up. And I didn't have any Central American students when I first started teaching in 1990. Now I have a lot of Central American students, but they don't know anything about what happened in the 1980s. they say their parents never want to talk to them about what was happening in their countries, why they came to the United States. And of course, my non-Central American students don't either. So that's why I called the book Central America's Forgotten History. Like, everybody wants to talk about immigration. Everybody has something to say about immigration and immigrant rights and immigration policies, but the history just isn't there. And I also have to point out that when it's always a huge honor and to meet with groups like yours, but there's always something distressing to me about seeing that everyone in these groups has hair as gray as mine. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm proud of it. But where are the young people? So, and I'm guessing that this organization also has its roots in the 1980s and in solidarity with the revolutions that were going on in the 1980s and in opposition to US policy in the 1980s. Am I right about that?
Even before that, RAC was started around the time Pinochet was
Okay.
in 1974, I think. So we're coming up to our 50th year pretty soon.
Wow. So, so I just wanted to start by recognizing things that I don't think any person in my university is aware of, but I bet all you guys are aware of, but that I'm always thinking about at the end of November and beginning of December is the anniversaries of the Jesuit massacre at the University of El Salvador, the Jesuit University in 1989. In the middle of November 1989, and tomorrow being the anniversary of the assassination of the 4 churchwomen in El Salvador in 1980. That was December 2nd, 1980. So, these were events that were really formative for me, I think would say for my generation, for our political consciousness, that have been completely erased. They just didn't happen as far as any of my students or any of my young colleagues in my history department are aware of. So many of us became interested in Central America during the 1980s or during the 1970s. I mean, I was a little too young to really be aware of Allende's election in 1970 or overthrow in 1973. But the tremendous hope that the Central American revolutions, whether unarmed revolutions like that in Chile of revolutionary movements achieving power through electoral means, or armed revolutions like those in Central America in the 1980s, the tremendous hope that they inspired in people around the world that what we now say, another world is possible, but it's hard for us to see it. I feel like in Chile in the early 70s and in Central America in the 80s, we saw that other world. We saw that other world being built, and it really helped us believe that other world was possible in a way that I think is hard for people to believe today. So, much of that revolutionary project was about redistribution. It was about creating an economy that is actually just, and that questions what the goal of the economy is and what the goal of economic development is, and says that the goal is to meet the basic needs of the poor, and rather than to make the rich richer. And that and a strong belief in the role and the capacity of a revolutionary state to do that. We're not in that era anymore. Now we're in the era that I will talk about tonight as being the era of neoliberalism, climate change, and mass migration. And so what I really intend to talk about tonight is sort of the intersection of neoliberalism, climate change, and mass migration. So to sort of answer the question of my colleague, like, how do you connect the contemporary migration to the revolution so long ago. I mean, of course, the first steps in the chain migration, and part of mass migrations is always chain patterns. That is somebody you know, a family member, somebody from your village, your uncle's cousin, somebody you have a connection to has moved to a place, and that then opens a pathway. You know somebody there who can help you get started. News comes back, remittances come back. These ties start to be connected, creating chain migrations. But even more than that, I would argue that it was the crushing of the revolutionary projects that opened the doors wide to the neoliberal economic project in Central America, the US-dominated neoliberal economic project. This is why the United States was trying to crush or overthrow the revolutions, was to, as William Blum called it in his book, kill hope, crush the idea that another world was possible, and to remind everybody that no, the role of the economy is to produce more stuff for the rich, and the role of the poor is to be exploited in order to produce more stuff for the rich. So that's my definition of neoliberalism. But that with the crushing of these revolutionary movements, there were no barriers remaining for the United States to really fully implement this neoliberal project in Central America. So what does this mean? It means the end of state-led development. That is that the role of the state under neoliberalism is to facilitate profits rather than to redistribute. It's to funnel upwards instead of to funnel downwards. It means the cutbacks in government social services, which is one way that the state can carry out a redistributive model, is through the funding of social services in Central America. Obviously, healthcare and education being really key to that, to meeting social services that meet the basic needs of the poor. Privatization of state enterprises that were a source of revenue for social services and a source of employment for the population. Free trade, which is of course a misnomer, because the United States calls it free trade because anything that's called free sounds good to people in the United States, but there's nothing at all free about it. I would say rather it is corporate friendly trade agreements that guarantee the freedom of multinational investors. So CAFTA, which was passed in, signed in 2005 and then implemented in the various countries of Central America in the years following, basically took sovereignty from the governments and put it in the hands of private corporations. So for example, private corporations are guaranteed the right to a deregulated environment. And if a government tries to pass regulations, things like protective labor regulations, minimum wage legislation, environmental regulations, those are defined as an obstacle to free trade, a violation of the free trade agreement. And the United States is there to make sure that these so-called free trade agreements are enforced, whether it's through military means, as in the overthrow of Zelaya in Honduras in 2009, or through the very mechanisms of the free trade agreements themselves, especially the investor-state dispute settlement system, where if there's any disagreement between the state and a foreign investor, the state has already ceded its sovereignty and said that it will accept the arbitration by the World Bank or other business-friendly venues that tend to almost always rule in favor of the investors and against the state. So it really means that the state cannot protect the interests of its population. It is defined and legislated in these international agreements that the state is there to protect the interest of foreign investors. The free trade agreements also, and this is a related aspect, open Central American markets to US products, especially agricultural products. which means that once again, the state has no capacity to protect small farmers. They can't provide seeds, they can't provide technical aid, they can't provide all of the inputs that small farmers need to survive. They can't put a price floor on what small farmers are producing to support their ability to continue to produce, because all of those are violations of the free market and the free trade. So Central American grain markets are flooded with products that the United States is not bound by these same rules. That is, the free trade agreements impose these rules on Central America, but not on the United States. So the US government is able to continue subsidizing and providing goods and services to large corporate agriculture, which then floods Central America with its cheap products, undermining the entire agricultural sector. The free trade agreements and the neoliberal policies that go along with them have supported a particular kind of economic development in Central America, which the United States has actually supported in Central America for over a century, taking advantage of natural resources, making sure that those natural resources remain cheap, and taking advantage of cheap Central American labor and making sure that that labor remains cheap. So some of the sectors that have really flourished under this new neoliberal free trade regime have been the maquiladora sector, that is the export processing sector, where US producers of things like textiles and garments and electronics outsource the labor-intensive phase of their production to Central America. The labor-intensive or the environmentally harmful phases of their production to Central America, take advantage of the lack of regulation there, of the cheap wages there, of the union-free environment that they're guaranteed there, because of course, another part of neoliberal governance is a very high level of violence. So one area of the state that continues to be very well funded under neoliberalism is the military and the police. And that is necessary to make sure that popular opposition can't arise. So the maquiladora sector, the export processing sector, new kinds of export agriculture, especially in products like palm oil, which is used both as an industrial input in so many products, like especially in processed foods, but we're not really aware of it, but we all eat and touch palm oil every day with any like soap or cosmetic product or dishwashing liquid, or pretty much any processed or packaged food. So turning land that was being used for subsistence production over to large landholders who can use it in the export market to support the profits of US industry, whether it's US investors or whether it's US buyers. Mining, as in the Testimonio book, the genocide of the 1980s opened up whole new territories for multinational mining in Guatemala, and not only in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras. And finally, tourism, that is turning Central America into a playground. And tourism also requires a lot of natural resources. It requires a lot of land, and it creates a lot of profit-making opportunities for foreign investors like hotel chains and airlines. And it needs a cheap source of labor. So that is the neoliberal model that's imposed on Central America with the crushing of the revolutions in the 1990s. And migration and climate change are both really deeply tied into this neoliberal model. So those are the three pillars that I'm talking about here: neoliberalism, migration, and climate change. So why migration? First of all, the loss of subsistence has been a big driver of migration out of Central America, as it has been in Mexico. And this is why a flood of Mexican migration followed NAFTA, as small corn farmers had their livelihoods destroyed by the influx of US corn. So land loss and the undermining of rural livelihoods through neoliberal reforms that prevent the state from supporting small farmers is one way that the neoliberal reforms drive migration. A second way is that the United States also has gone through a period of neoliberal reform in the same decades of the 1990s and the 2000s that we're all aware of in the shrinking of the middle class, the multiple debt crises and foreclosures and student debt, the skyrocketing housing costs, housing bubbles, the shift, the growing productivity, but where wages are not keeping up with productivity, so that the profits are going up to the top. And there's been a huge expansion along with this of a low wage service sector to maintain this increasingly squeezed and pressed middle class that now has no time to do things like take care of their own children and cook their own food and mow their own lawns. And because of the increasing work demands on this middle class, as it's also shrinking, there's been a huge expansion of the low wage labor market, and especially a demand for undocumented labor. So undocumented labor in the United States has moved from being just in agriculture, which is pretty much where it started, to filling huge areas of the service sector, whether it's in food processing, and the use of processed food has also skyrocketed in this period, whether it's in restaurants, chains, pretty much every restaurant in the entire United States has Latino dishwashers. In jobs that have been downgraded in the United States, like factory work, meat processing, garment and textile work that has stayed in the United States has been de-unionized and downgraded and shifted to undocumented and immigrant workers. So there's been a huge demand for immigrant labor in the neoliberal economy of the United States, which is another way that neoliberal reforms have driven migration by creating the demand for labor. And this system becomes self-perpetuating because of remittances. So Central American migrants who come to the United States then send money back home to sustain their families that cannot survive in neoliberal Central America except through the remittances. And then the remittances then drive further migration because people see, well, people are getting rich in the United States because they have money to send home. And US investors in Central America actually depend on the remittance system as well, because that's a way that they can keep labor so underpaid there, because they know that people also have access to remittances coming from the United States. So it's really a kind of a vicious cycle of migration and remittances. And then the final reason I would point to, way that neoliberalism and migration are so deeply tied, is that the tremendous hope and optimism of the 1980s, even in time of war, that is belief that life could be better and that a new Central America could be created. The crushing of that dream also has turned migration into an attractive alternative. Like there's no point in even trying to do anything here. Of course, as we see in Testimonio, there's still resistance in Central America, but I think the widespread hopes that resistance can bring about a different world it's quite a different moment than it was in the 1980s. So where does climate change? Oh, one other thing, I'll wait with that. Okay, so where does climate change fit into all of this? In a lot of different ways. So of course, in addition to the loss of state services and state support for small agriculture and the flooding of Central American agricultural markets, climate change itself is undermining subsistence agriculture. in Central America, especially in the dry zone in the northern, what are called the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, have been severely affected by drought, by hurricanes that are induced by the increasing impact of the warming climate. A second way that climate change affects migration, or climate change and migration are intertwined, is that in its attempts to make it look like our emissions are going down in the United States, one tactic is outsourcing of dirty industries, so that industrial processes that create high levels of emissions can be outsourced to poor countries, and then the emissions are accounted towards those countries. So to the extent that we see US emissions starting to level off in the 2000s, there's several different causes, and the shift, the promotion of natural gas and the shift from coal to natural gas is one of them. But another really important one, and you can see this when you look at the divergence between production-based emissions and consumption-based emissions, is that we are outsourcing so much of what we consume. We're no longer producing it here. So if you look at the emissions, if you count the emissions of everything we consume towards the United States, you don't see that leveling off and slight decline that you see if you look only at production-based emissions. This is something I had to really get into for the climate change book. And then our mythical shift to green energy, the mythical concept of green energy, which I actually argue doesn't exist in my climate change book, also relies on Central American resources, whether it's palm oil that is used for ethanol, for gasoline powered cars to reduce the emissions of fossil fuels by supplementing it with plant-based fuels, most of which are imported. And that's the other major use of palm oil. Or whether it is the inputs for the batteries, the lithium, the copper, whether those are for transportation vehicles or whether they are as part of the production of solar and wind power, means that you need huge storage facilities. And so part of the commodity boom of mining in Central America and all of Latin America has been to support the production of so-called green energy in the wealthy countries, so that, again, they can look like they're reducing their emissions because they are outsourcing the costs of their overuse of energy to other countries. The United States is also promoting economic policies in Central America that directly contribute to more climate change. And we can see this in basically every US development package to Central America, going all the way back to George W. Bush's Plan Merida, and through the Obama administration. Trump was less interested in economic aid for economic development in Central America, but Biden sailed into office with this new idea for his plan for security and prosperity in Central America, and how we're going to give so much aid to Central America to prevent people from migrating. But in fact, the US aid does exactly the opposite. It promotes both climate change and migration. It promotes climate change by funding primarily this kind of economic development that we were talking about before, mega projects, tourism, basically deforestation, and extraction of natural resources, which contributes to more climate change, and displaces people and pushes them into the migrant stream, of course. Finally, as migrants come to the United States, it's true that they raise their standard of living, because to survive, and raising your standard of living means that you consume more fossil fuels. And to survive in the United States, you have to consume fossil fuels. That is, our society is designed so that it's virtually impossible to survive here without becoming a much higher consumer of fossil fuels. And one of the very first things immigrants have to get when they get here is a car, because you cannot do anything here without a car. So one of the pseudo-environmental objections to immigration is that, oh, well, immigrants come here and then they consume more, so it's bad. So more immigration is bad for climate change. We need to reduce the population of the high consuming countries. Well, another way of looking at that would be to say we need to reduce the consumption of high consuming countries, not by reducing the number of people, but by reducing the ways that we use fossil fuels. Another element of the neoliberal era has been, as government services have declined, the huge influx of NGOs and small privately funded projects for economic development, and the role of so-called civil society in partnering with international organizations to fund development projects. Unfortunately, what a lot of studies have shown is that the influx of NGO money, given the almost impossibility of sustainability under current socioeconomic arrangements for small businesses or subsistence agriculture in Central America, the influx of NGO money often goes to fund migration. That is, if somebody has access to a few $1,000s, the most logical thing they can do with it is get to the United States, because if they try to invest it in something in Central America, it's going to be lost. If they come to the United States, they have the chance of actually making more and sending it back in remittances. Debt plays a huge role here too, because many families become heavily indebted to send somebody to the United States. They need to send a child to the United States to get out of debt, but they need to incur more debt to send somebody to the United States. So most migrants arrive here with a huge debt that they have to start out by repaying. But if something happens, if they're injured, if they don't make it to the United States, if they die, the family is left with the debt. So it's this debt-fueled vicious cycle going on with migration. Remittances have in fact become the major source of income in much of Central America, sometimes following some major export crops, in some cases the major source of income, far outweighing any US aid. If you look at any year since mass migration has started, you know, Biden's plan for Central America was promising $4 billion over 4 years. Well, Guatemalan migrants send back $9 billion every year in remittances to their country. So really, it's remittances that are funding economic development. But it's a twisted kind of economic development, because often what remittances fund is more migration. And remittances make almost any kind of work seem pointless or meaningless in Central America, because the wages that one earns there are so pitifully low compared to what families can receive if a child comes to the United States to work. In some ways, we could say that migration is a safety valve that allows the neoliberal economic model to function. And that's why, in many ways, despite all of the railing against immigration, the United States knows that immigration is the basis of this economic system, which is profitable for US corporations, whether in Central America or here. The economies of Central America, the economies of the United States, and the profits of corporations are all quite dependent on this model of migration and remittances to allow them to pay low wages and make profits. It's a safety valve. It also maintains social peace in Central America. That is the ability of young people to leave, keeps them from becoming revolutionaries. But it also has created huge inequalities and contributed to gangs and crime and violence in Central America. Finally, I guess I would say that, and here I'm talking about sort of the paradox of how all these pieces fit together, that migration frees more land for foreign organized economic development, for, whether it's export agriculture, whether it's tourism. Convincing people to leave is the easiest way to get rid of them and make the land accessible. So I guess I would like to end by saying, given this sort of rather grim picture of the economic relationship between the United States and Central America and the possibilities for Central America under the current arrangements, what should the United States do? What should we be fighting for the United States to do at this point? So I have 5 ideas. One is, I'm very skeptical of the whole concept of aid, but there is one kind of aid that Central America actually desperately needs right now, which is pandemic aid. They need vaccines. They need infrastructure to distribute vaccines. So this is one kind of aid that if the United States was really interested in doing anything to help Central America, they could be doing. And when I say vaccines, it's not only like charity donations of vaccines, but it's changing the system that is Latin American countries should be able to produce their own vaccines. Vaccines should not be a profit-making enterprise that's in the hands of, again, the same few multinationals. But looking a little bit bigger than that, the rules for international trade have to be drastically reformed. And, we were talking about this in the 1990s, opposing the World Trade Organization, opposing the free trade agreements. But I feel like we've become a little bit complacent about them. Like now they just are the way things are. But we have to go back to really questioning, why is trade organized the way it is, with all the power and benefits in the hands of corporations and none of it in the hands of the poor in Latin America? So the trade rules have to be drastically reformed. Governments have to be allowed, without being overthrown or legally restricted from, to protect the interests of their populations, and populations have to have the right to press for their rights. A third piece is a debt jubilee. That is the system of international lending and debt has made sustainable or equitable economic development almost impossible in the indebted countries like those of Central America, and gives extraordinary power to international lending organizations and banks that basically can control the economies of these countries, and they do it obviously in their own interests. So a debt jubilee is number 3 in my list of what needs to be done to create a more just environment. The fourth thing would be to open the border and to raise the minimum wage. And I put those two together. Maybe I should put them separately, but to open the border, because migration is happening. It's going to continue to happen. It can either happen under extremely exploitative and dangerous circumstances, or it can happen in safe and productive ways. Yes, it's a little more profitable if we keep it happening in exploitative and dangerous ways, but of course it would be more just to allow it to happen in open and productive ways. So, so opening the border, allowing free migration, and raising the minimum wage in the United States. That is the cycle of debt and remittances. we could create much more aid for Central America by raising the minimum wage in the United States so that migrants would have something more to send back to their families than by taxing US citizens and putting that towards foreign aid. And finally, I think that reducing our use of fossil fuels would be a really important way of aiding Central America because of the role that climate change is playing in all of this and is going to be playing in even stronger ways in the coming years. So I didn't see anybody raise their hand the whole time I was talking, but I hope you have some questions or comments.
Okay, anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Avi about your experiences or share with us? Just have to unmute yourselves and then pipe up.
About the $4 billion that Biden wants invested, can you say anything more about how it's being carried out, or do you have any observations what's going on there in terms of policy?
Well, so, you know, Biden is, the $4 billion in economic aid is embedded in this plan for security and prosperity. So the $4 billion is the prosperity part, but it can't be separated from the security part. And security, of course, is a word that should always raise some suspicions. The security means militarization, and it means an expansion of, again, this goes all the way back to 2007 and Plan Merida, which was when the very first attempts to force Mexico to militarize its southern border, to outsource US immigration enforcement. And now not only to Mexico, but also to Guatemala and to Honduras. That is, all three countries are being given military aid and training to militarize their own southern borders, to not really to stop the flow of migrants, but to make migrants more vulnerable, to make migration more dangerous, and to pander to anti-immigrant constituencies in the United States. So, you know, Biden has been a big disappointment on immigration so far, for those who had any hopes for Biden on immigration. But so first of all, we have to think about the prosperity, the security part of security and prosperity. But then we also have to look at what is meant by prosperity. And prosperity basically means investment in mega projects that are very profitable, but that displace people and undermine people's livelihoods, and that rely on this precise neoliberal economic development model that it's not prosperity in terms of the kinds of social investment that Central America actually needs. It's prosperity in terms of a trickle-down theory of enticing foreign investors to create low-wage jobs and calling that prosperity.
Was there any model you'd recommend? I mean, I take it there's no land redistribution in the Biden plan that I've seen. They have this consortium of 12 companies.
I mean, again, I think that, you know, that's why I went through I don't know how many they were because of the way I wrote them down and divided them up, my 4 or 5 or 6 recommendations that, you know, economic aid can't be conceived in terms of helping corporations, imagining that by helping corporations make more money, it's going to improve the lives of the poor. That, you know, it's not up to the United States to implement land reforms in Central America. But it is up to the United States to allow Central Americans the sovereignty to do those things. And all of the ways that we put money into Central America are kind of do exactly the opposite. So I guess I'm saying we need to think bigger rather than, well, could we direct our aid in a slightly different way, isn't really going to answer the question. It isn't really going to address the question. Something like a debt jubilee, like raising the minimum wage in the United States, like opening the border, like seriously reducing our own use of fossil fuels and alternative pseudo-green energies, changing the trade rules. Those are the kinds of things, more than saying, oh, well, we could use the $1 billion for this particular, project instead of that particular project. But I mean, Central Americans also have the right to self-determination and to sovereignty and to choose their own economic priorities. And, right now, the countries are, it was a very different moment in the 1980s where there actually were strong popular movements that had the capacity, or would have had the capacity if it wasn't for the United States, to implement really different and revolutionary forms of economic development. Right now, the Central American countries, we don't know exactly what's going to be happening in Honduras, but the rest of the Central American countries are governed by the same elite coalitions that are benefiting from the current economic arrangements. But I don't think that means that the United States should be planning an intervention to overthrow them either. But there certainly are things that we can do that, like right now, everything that we're doing is strengthening the power of the elites and weakening the possibilities for popular movements to make change. So our policies should be geared in the opposite direction.
Avi, I have a question in the chat that asks, what was Kamala Harris saying to blame Central American countries?
She was saying, just don't come. That was her most famous comment when she went to Guatemala, basically to give them this quid pro quo. That is, yes, we want to help you, but only if you agree to let us set up military bases and train the Guatemalan soldiers on your southern border to prevent migrants from coming through. So she went with this kind of dual agenda, or maybe a triple agenda, to say, just don't come. And again, I think a lot of that is really just pandering to the right wing and to the anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. And to more loudly offer economic aid and to more quietly condition that on military collaboration on Guatemala's southern border. So, I mean, it definitely looks bad for Biden, and I think that's why he sent her there. It looks bad for Biden in the current political climate. If we're going to, concede to the current political climate, it looks bad to have immigrants arriving at the border. So Biden doesn't want it, not because he cares one way or the other about poor Central Americans or even about immigration. All he cares about is making the Democrats look good.
What are you seeing that gives you hope?
It gives me hope.
Yes.
Well, I guess I would say that the protests outside COP26 gave me hope. Like the feeling like that there really is a strong global and especially youth upsurge of protest against what our generation is doing to the world. But also like organizations like yours, like people who have, there's a great quote from Bertolt Brecht that is repeated by the Cuban singer-songwriter Silvio Rodriguez in introducing one of his songs that says, hay hombres que luchan un día y son buenos. Hay hombres que luchan un año y son muy buenos. Y hay los que luchan toda la vida y ellos son los imprescindibles. There are people who struggle for one day and they're great. There's people who struggle for a year and they're really good. And then there's people who struggle for their whole lives and they're the ones who we can't do without. So, when my students ask like, what kind of activism should they be getting involved in? You know, how can they change the world? And I always like repeat that quote to them and say, you know, if you're going to be an activist for a day or a month, that's great. But if you really want to change the world, you have to be an activist for your whole life. So think about something that's going to be meaningful and rewarding for you to do, where you're going to be able to stick with it and not, you know, go show your face and then disappear again. So I would say, you know, despite my comment at the beginning about like, where are the young people? It's also really heartening to see people who have been in the struggle for decades.
Yes, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's me. I wish you would comment a bit more on the trade issue and what's wrong with the trade agreements. From my perspective, I think about everything in terms of food, having been a farmer. We opened up our borders for all kinds of imports. And that really plays into the same elite you've been referring to, who've taken over so much of the land to produce food for export to the United States.
So, I mean, I think the issue of food sovereignty is a really key one. And I mean food sovereignty, not necessarily in terms of national sovereignty, but in terms of who controls the food system. And right now, it's multinationals that control the food system. And when multinationals control the food system, their goals are, one is to process as much as possible, because that's where the value added comes, you know, so they can make more money off of more processing. Two is mass production, which means monocultures. Three is highly mechanized, pesticide and fertilizer heavy production, because the you know, the interlocking system of profit comes from the chemical companies, the fossil fuel companies, the pesticide and fertilizer companies, the agricultural machinery production. All of those bring more profit into the system, and they're sort of mutually dependent on each other. And all of them depend on pushing small farmers off the land, whether that's in Central America or in the United States. They depend on access to cheap exploited labor, again, whether it's in Central America or Mexico or the United States. They turn agricultural work into heavily exploited work. You know, if agricultural work historically has been a kind of a village level, had an aspect to it, which is a, you know, village communal, you know, deeply embedded in traditional cultures of sharing and reciprocity and production and collective control of a local economy. You know, the current system is the exact opposite of that. So I was emphasizing the US agricultural exports to Central America that undermine small farming in Central America and undermine food sovereignty in Central America, because small farmers can produce their food, they save their seeds, but none of that is creating a profit, and it frequently requires government support to be sustainable. So, you know, the neoliberal and free trade model makes sure there is no government support for that, and channels the government support to the mass production. But Central American agricultural exports obviously pour into the United States as well. You know, historically, it was coffee and bananas. And again, both plantation crops that rely on dispossession of small farmers and turning self-sufficient small farmers into heavily exploited proletariat of agricultural workers on the plantations. then in the mid 20th century, the big economic development push by the United States was for Central Americans to diversify their agricultural exports, but in ways that are heavily tied into the US corporations, to produce more cotton, to produce beef. And our fast food industry that developed after World War II was heavily reliant on Central American beef production. The United States funded the building of slaughterhouses. They funded the mechanization, pesticides and fertilizers for the spread of cotton production. Cotton required a heavily exploited and poisoned, because cotton was very pesticide dependent, workforce. Cattle required very little labor, so it pushed people off their land without even creating these terrible jobs for people to move to. And you know, there were a couple of books published in the late 1980s, Export Agriculture and the Crisis in Central America. And I'm not remembering the author's name of that one. And the other one was by Charles Brockett, Land, Power, and Poverty, that see the US aid in the 1960s and 70s, the sort of Alliance for Progress, you know, predecessor to Obama's Alliance for Prosperity and Biden's plan for security and prosperity, as being the cause of the Central American revolutions.
And that all ties in really well with what's happening in this country with farm labor, where more and more of the labor is H-2A workers, guest workers, from the Central American countries.
Which is another system.
That will expand that is called the Farm Labor Modernization Act. It modernizes it by making it fit in perfectly with what you've just described, this industrial system that uses people.
I mean, that kind of guest worker system is yet another method of making sure that workers are marginalized, have no rights, and are more exploitable. And, you know, it's taking advantage of the socioeconomic realities to say, well, here, we don't need to use violence to repress the labor force. We can do it through laws.
Avi, I've noticed that in my work with the Mayans in the Rabinal and Rio Negro area of Guatemala, that they're trying to produce a model where it's more of local productions and more local reliance upon what they can produce themselves. And by that, I mean, I don't know, years and years ago, there was a book, and I think it's still around, it's called When Corporations Rule the World by Jack Corton. And I think that, if I remember it right, because I read it so many years ago, was the bottom line was to rely more upon your local stores and your local suppliers and vendors in order to help control this corporate greed that's out there. But the Mayans I've been working with, of course, in Rio Negro, they were displaced by the Chicxulub hydroelectric dam project. And some of the
one
people
of
there,
many examples of how what we call green or alternative energy is not really green or just anyway.
And they were subjected to 5 different massacres just in that one little village alone. And there were several other villages upstream that were subjected to the same violence. And they're still dealing with that so many years later. But they've done their own subsistence farming there. They're doing seed saving. They're bringing back the indigenous crops that were lost during the Civil War there, and the institutional knowledge that was lost by the men being massacred and killed. And then they're trying to find different ways to market that. They're also teaching other Guatemalans, agencies and groups how to do the subsistence farming. The other thing I've noticed is that more of the Mayans are actually getting to go to universities now. And I think that that's a positive sign of hope there too, in that hopefully through them and through getting more education and knowing more about how the systems work, they may be able to get into positions where they'll be able to change that. But, to get back to the frustrations that you see, like the Democrats in so many ways are just perpetuating the same terrible things that the other guys are doing. And you see that like when the Democrats cheered when they were talking about Guaido in the State of the Union address that Trump did. And it's Democrats are cheering this Guaido on, and it was an illegal action that they were taking, trying to force out an elected government. The same thing is starting to take place in Nicaragua now with the Renacer Act. We don't like it when they meddle with our elections, as we got, angry with Russia and China and whoever else was involved. But yet we turn around and do the exact same thing. And it's been going on for so many years. I mean, why don't they realize that this is not working? This system does not work. We haven't brought democracy to any place that we've said we're bringing it to.
Because it's nobody's goal to bring democracy. If you look at, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Cuba, if you look at what's going on internally in the US government in the periods where the documents, the internal documents are now publicly available and declassified, although not everything is declassified, of course, they're quite open about their goals, and bringing democracy is never among their goals. But that's what they want us to believe. That's what they say in public, but that's not what they say in private.
There's something people in this group can have some influence on. Right now, the Climate Action Council is completing the scoping plan for the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And part of that relates to agriculture and forestry. And in agriculture, one of the things that's been chosen as the best investments for reducing methane is putting caps on the manure pits of the very biggest dairies, CAFOs, and adding methane digesters, anaerobic digesters. If we insist that none of the money goes to those biggest farms, that they be forced to pay themselves for those investments if they want them. Because that's what ties in with the H2A workers. Dairy farms used to be a good job for a few local people. Now they're dependent on a large number of workers because the dairy farms are so big. So it's all tied in together, but here's something where our voices might really make a difference.
And I mean, I really do feel that the struggle against climate change, which is really a struggle against our economic system, is so deeply tied to the struggles of the Central American poor for food sovereignty and for, grassroots democracy.
Other questions or thoughts?
Is there anything about Costa Rica's government and how they interact with either other Central American governments or our government that is positive or helpful?
Certainly there are things to admire about Costa Rica. The amount of land they are protecting in terms of rainforest, the fact that they showed that a small poor country can get rid of its army and thus have money available for social investment. I think that the Costa Rican exceptionalism has it certainly has been imbued with a kind of racism you know, we're the one good country in Central America and everybody else stay out because you're going to ruin us because we're like the good guys. It's also been heavily undermined by neoliberalism in Costa Rica as well. So, you know, what we think of as their great social welfare state has really been tattered to a certain extent by the last 20 years. You know, clearly neither Costa Rica nor Nicaragua is afflicted by the kind of violence and just dreadful exclusion that we see in Guatemala and El Salvador. So, you know, those are definitely positive things. You know, in terms of the international politics and foreign policies, I'm not sure I can really say much. I don't think that the United States is very influenced by any Central American country. It's following its own agendas. And, you know, if it's convenient to, you know, rope a Costa Rican president like Oscar Arias into proposing a US-friendly peace plan that can undermine the Latin American Contadora much more hopeful and just peace plan. You know, Arias is associated with peace, and like, peace is better than war, but he was basically manipulated to serve the interests of the United States in avoiding the kind of peace the United States didn't want and getting the kind of peace the United States did want.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, Paul, unmute yourself, Paul, and
anyways, oh dear, I just lost my thought. I apologize. I love what you've had to say, and I'm sorry I had to come late. Scheduling conflict with someone that I couldn't miss. Oh yeah, I did have a question in the chat about about how trusted liberal institutions can spread disinformation. And what inspired that question was I read an article in the Atlantic, and the author didn't hide the fact, because she said so in her article, that she's a member of the NED. And then she had disparaging things to say about the Maduro model, for example. So what do you know of among respected liberal institutions, organizations, who are the ones that spread the most disinformation?
So when you say trusted liberal organizations, what are you referring to? Like trusted by whom? And like, for example, what? I don't even really understand what
well,
category you're referring to.
I guess part of the reason I asked it that way is because I would imagine the Atlantic magazine is a trusted resource for people to get good information. And I also understand the Atlantic magazine to be a more liberal-leaning periodical, and it was something that a friend of mine who I respect for her understanding of things in her worldview gave me that article to kind of inform me about things, and I was really disappointed to discover a lot of what this person was saying. So I guess maybe it's better to, instead of saying, how about just periodicals then?
I think you should trust Graham Russell and Rights Action. They publish amazing on the ground news about what's going on in Central America. And I actually am not sure of Sandra Cuffey, who worked with Rights Action for many years. I'm not sure if she's freelancing now or if she's still writing for Rights Action, but she also publishes great. So, I mean, I don't think there's any mainstream organizations or media that are going to really, in a fundamental way, question the role of the United States in the world. But there certainly are plenty of smaller scale grassroots organizations, and on the border there is No More Deaths. There's Witness on the Border. There's, I would say it's really coming from smaller organizations that are working on specific issues. And, I think that book Testimonio that you were talking about, and it's on my list for reading over this break. That's the kind of source where you're really going to get information that is not constrained by the mainstream of US politics and what we're supposed to be saying about Latin America.
Thank you.
I think we're going to leave it at that at this time. Avi, I can't tell you how pleased and honored we've been that you were able to join us tonight and share some of your vast knowledge with us and your experiences. You're doing good work. Keep it up. And anything that we can do to support you here from Rochester and the Buffalo area, we're more than happy to do that. Just keep in touch, and also let me know when your book is available for release, and we'll get the word out up here in upstate New York. Again, anybody out there in our listening audience tonight, thank you very much for joining us for this interesting presentation. We hope that you'll come back next month on January 5th, when we'll be talking about Nicaragua and getting an on-the-ground perspective of the current situation there. And also to invite you to let us know if you're interested in joining the RACWA Steering Committee and helping to guide us forward as we go towards our 50th year. We'd love to have you and to meet you and talk to you about it. And anybody that's willing to help us on the committee to get another successful rice and beans fundraiser dinner going, be happy to hear from you. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Avi, again, thank you. And we wish you well with the new book.
Yeah, great
And
presentation.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, everybody, have a good night and have a good holiday. And we'll see you after the holidays. Take care.
You should send me the information on the Nicaragua talk. I might like to come and listen to it if I can.
I'd be happy to. If you don't mind, we'll even put you on our mailing list and you'll get a notice of all of our upcoming meetings and presentations if you'd like.
Sure.
It's up to you. But yeah, I can send that to you. And also any of our previous talks are on our website, racla.org. And so you can always go to our website and hear some other interesting thoughts and perspectives on Latin America. So thank you very much. I understand I understand you're pretty good friends with Brinton Likes. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
no, not that there's anything negative between us, but we just live in really different parts of the Boston area, so I don't see her that often.
Yeah.
In Boston is kind of like this thing that's impossible to get through. So
I hear you.
But yes, we're great comrades, colleagues.
Yeah, she's another recipient of our White Dove Award for the rice and beans dinner. We had her as our honored guest for one of our dinners about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. So very
Thank you
good.
again, Avi. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night. I'm going to end the meeting for everyone and wish you well.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.